The second presentation, Estimating and Projecting Urbanization and City Growth. This research project combines the expertise of Professor Gavin Jones from the Department of Sociology and the Asia Research Institute and Professor Leontine Alkema from the Department of Statistics and Applied Probability. I now call upon the project's principal investigator, Professor Jones, to please introduce the project.
Well, good morning. I'm going to make the earlier part of our presentation, then I'll hand over to Leontina, my collaborator, to present the later part of the presentation. The title of our project is Estimating and Projecting Urbanization and City Growth. Why is it relevant to GAI's mission? Well, we would argue that GAI's research activities do require insights into past and future trends in urban city and urban agglomeration populations. And the current estimates and projections for these populations need to be improved upon in various ways. Now, first of all, we think we know what we mean by urban and rural, and if you look at the two pictures on the outside there, it's pretty clear that the left-hand one is rural and the right-hand one is urban. But the middle one, which is rather polluted, as peri-urban areas often are, so you can't see it very well, shows the sort of uncertain zones that develop these days, particularly in relation to urban agglomerations and other urban areas. And the issue of what is urban and what is rural becomes quite a bit more complex. So this binary distinction between urban and rural is a rather crude way to describe what is in fact a continuum, and there's been quite a bit of research going into this. And nowhere is this dilemma of urban-rural definition more marked than in these fringe areas of urban agglomerations, which are marked by a very complex mix of both land use and employment. So why bother about the urban-rural divide at all? It does continue to have some meaning in differentiating populations in terms of various measures of well-being, access to health and education services, and needed government investments. The UN Population Division has always produced the estimates of urban and rural populations for the world and projections of these, and these are very widely used by many international agencies and other agencies. It's the only source for estimates and projections of urbanization for all countries. You do have some other databases of relevance, but the only one that's produced for all countries is by the UN Population Division, and necessarily then it's used very widely by a lot of people. And the World Urbanization Prospect, which they produce, also publishes urban agglomeration estimates and projections based on data supplied by and definitions of urban agglomerations used by each country. They don't attempt to modify those, nor do they attempt to modify the definitions of urbanization which are used by each country because of the complexity of doing that. Now, just very briefly, according to the UN estimates, this shows the proportion urban in 2005 to 2010, and then this one shows what's projected to happen by 2045 to 2050 in the UN projections. And looking at, again, comparing them, you can see a considerable darkening of that, and by 2045 to 2050, you've got, go on to the next one. You've got, most of the Americas and most of Europe and other parts of the world over 80% urban according to these definitions. And perhaps once you reach those sorts of levels, you might argue that these kinds of projections are of less interest. But if you look at the Asian region, even by 2045 to 2050, you don't have very many countries where urbanization is expected to reach those levels. And therefore, tracking and projecting Asia's urbanization path is a meaningful exercise, we would argue. Now, the problem is the widely different definition of urban areas in use. Just as an example, here's a comparison between Thailand and the Philippines. You would normally expect that the level of urbanization in a country would be fairly closely related to things like per capita incomes, the proportion of the workforce working in non-agricultural activities and things like that. If you look at Thailand and the Philippines, if you look at 1970, Thailand was a little wealthier than the Philippines was a little wealthier than Thailand at that point, and it also had a lower proportion of the workforce in agriculture, and therefore, as you might expect, its level of urbanization was higher than in Thailand. But 33% as against 13%, that doesn't look very correct. Now, if you fast forward it to 2000, you've had major changes in the structure of the economy and society. Thailand had double the per capita GNP of the Philippines by that stage. The gap in the proportion of the workforce in agriculture had narrowed quite a bit, but the percentage urban remained very widely apart. In fact, if you look at 1990 there, Philippines 47% urban and Thailand 19% urban. And then by 2000, this gap had narrowed a bit. Now, there's not time to go into this story in detail, but the main aspects of the story that we'd want to stress are that much of it has to do with different definitions of urban areas. The Philippines has a much more generous definition of what is included as urban areas than Thailand did. There was some modification of those definitions between 1990 and 2000, which brought their estimates rather closer together. But even today, Thailand has a much more restrictive definition of urban areas than the Philippines does. And so the point of this is that, you know, when you're making inter-country comparisons with the data that the UN is using, you have to be very careful, and you need a lot of background knowledge of these kinds of issues in order to make sense of the data. Now, the urbanization projections of the UN are based on the convergence of the urban-rural growth differential to a global norm for all countries. In other words, they look ahead, they look at the trends in the difference over time between urban and rural growth rates and have it converging towards a global norm. The drawbacks of this are first that it's only a best guess with no uncertainty assessment, and secondly, it's criticised for over-projecting urbanisation. Now, somebody has looked into the over-projection of urbanisation and looked at the errors in the forecast between the projections conducted in 1980 and 1990 and 1995. The estimated levels of urbanisation in the year 2000. And as you can see, for most parts of the world, particularly those conducted in 1980 and in 1990, considerably over-projected the level of urbanisation that was found to be the case in the year 2000. Although, again, I would stress that the level of urbanisation in 2000 still depends on the definitions used in the individual countries. Now turning to the issue of cities and urban agglomerations, there's great variability in what's included in urban agglomerations as reported to the UN. Now, in some work that I did in collaboration with Mike Douglas, who's also here, we did this book on mega-urban regions in Pacific Asia, in which we took a number of the very large cities in this region and re-examined the basis for estimating urban agglomerations and defined mega-urban regions based on various criteria, which I could go into if you like in detail. And based on that, and in collaboration with the statistics officers in 5 different countries in the region, we derived different data for 1990 and 2000 censuses to look at trends in the different zones of these urban agglomerations. And what came out of that, of course, was, I think, a more nuanced picture than you get from looking at just the urban agglomeration figures of the United Nations. Now, in looking at growth of cities, particularly of the very large cities, the changes in the boundaries of urban agglomerations are often not taken into account. And we do need a better understanding of the dynamics of change. And to some extent, we hope to do that for the cities that were included in this earlier study. The difficulty, of course, is that the 2010 round of censuses is being conducted right now throughout the region, and there'll only be a limited amount of data becoming available for these cities and their surrounding areas during the period of this study. So in some ways the study needs to continue further into the future to fully take into account the need for new data. So, okay, this is just an example of the procedure that we used in that study, taking the example of Bangkok. For Bangkok, of course, you have the official metropolitan area defined by the statistics people, and then you have all sorts of enumeration districts around that. And according to the criteria that we were using, and these are to do with density, agricultural employment, and so on, we defined the core, which in most of the cities we studied was the official metropolitan area, but in the case of Bangkok was a little modified. And then we had the inner zone, that's the lighter grey colour, some to the north, east and south of the official metropolitan area, and then the outer zone, which extends further to the west, somewhat to Korn, to the southeast to Chonburi, and so on. And of course, you can define it in so many ways. You could have included the whole coastal region down to Pattaya and beyond, according to certain criteria. And similarly up north, Ayutthaya is in there, but there are other parts of the area north of Bangkok which are not included. So there's a great deal of variability, but we did this according to the criteria that we determined, and at least there's a greater degree of comparability with the other mega urban regions that we were dealing with. Okay, so just a few comments about urban agglomerations and urban hierarchies. The modification of the urban agglomeration estimates can greatly affect the study of urban hierarchies in different countries. And you know, the urban hierarchy is a matter of looking at the gradation of urban areas by their sizes, and there are all sorts of rules like the rank size rule which are applied, which show certain typical commonalities in the way that these size of city distributions go. But these are very much affected by the growth of urban agglomerations, and Malaysia, which is probably familiar to most people here, is a very striking example of this. If you look at the official figures on urban areas in Asia as produced by the Department of Statistics, of the 10 largest towns, one of them is Kuala Lumpur, and 5 of the others lie within 30 kilometres of downtown Kuala Lumpur. But they're listed as separate urban areas, and that includes Petaling Jaya and places which I would challenge you in driving from Kuala Lumpur to Petaling Jaya to work out where the boundary lies, except that you do drive at one point through a rather large archway that the Selangor government wanted to try to indicate that you were moving into Selangor state. So you have all of these cities and towns which are actually part of one urban agglomeration but which are listed as separate towns, and the official urban agglomeration supplied by Malaysia to the UN Population Division gives Kuala Lumpur's population at about 1.4 million, whereas the urban agglomeration is really about 5 or 6 million. And so urban systems analysis based on such data can be seriously misleading. We might think of the Singapore example here. There's not much analysis of Singapore done on the basis of an international urban agglomeration, but when you think of it, Johor Bahru and then Batam and Bintan in Indonesia are all part of the urban agglomeration of Singapore, and once you start to analyse things in that way, you get a rather different picture. So, in summary, for cities and urban agglomeration projections, the UN Population Division doesn't do any uncertainty assessment in its projections. And as somebody has noted, the history of UN city projections does not inspire confidence. If you look at them over time, there's a lot of jumping around depending on the approaches that they've used. And we think that we can assist by a more careful evaluation of what's happening in some of the countries within this region. So in summary, current estimates for urban agglomeration and city population suffer from comparability problems. There's room for improvement in the projection methodologies with respect to model assumptions and including an uncertainty assessment. The analysis of the proportion urban and various determinants will be conducted to construct more comparable estimates of urbanization levels by country, might say correlates and determinants. Modified estimates of urban agglomeration populations for a number of major Asian cities based on census data. And we have some colleagues, particularly in India, who are going to do some further work in relation to this project on Indian cities. Analysis of time trends in urban hierarchies in Asian countries modified to take account of city growth outside official boundaries and growth of multi-nodal mega-urban regions. As I say, we will be limited by the availability of data from the 2010 census, but we'll go as far as we can with what's available. At this point, Leontina is going to take over.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to take over to talk about our research approach for improved projections of urban populations and cities and urban agglomerations. So we have three goals here. The first one is not so much an improvement, but it's about studying the projection methods that are being used in this region. We plan to visit city planners to see what projection methodology they use, to document the methods and do a comparative study of the methods used. So we plan to visit the planners in, say, Kuala Lumpur, Jakarta, Bandung, Singapore as well, and so on. Then the second and the third goal, developing new techniques for projections of urban populations and of urban agglomerations and cities. For those two goals, our ultimate goal is to develop methods that can be used by the United Nations Population Division to include in their world urbanization prospects, which are used worldwide. The idea for cities is to look at past trends within the city, so city growth rates, as well as trends within the country with respect to urbanization and trends in city hierarchies within the country. For urban projections, we plan to use the proportion urban as given by the national definitions that the UN uses currently, but also work with our revised estimates of proportion urban within a country based on the approach that Kevin just talked about. Now to give a little bit more insight into what I mean by techniques for projections and to maybe cross borders of different disciplines, I'd like to illustrate our techniques by small examples. So to use urban projections as an example, our goal is to construct probabilistic projections of urban populations. And so I found that many non-statisticians don't really like the word probabilistic, but the only thing I mean with that is moving away from the one guess kind of projections. So specifically to quantify the uncertainty in projections, in this case of urban populations. In other words, instead of giving one best guess of future outcomes, we plan to give the user of projections a range of likely outcomes and relate a probability statement to those outcomes. Now to come up with projections, we need a projection model. For projecting proportion urban in a country, our projection model will be based on historical trends of proportion urban within a country, as well as estimates and projections of demographic indicators. that might be related to urbanization, such as changing age structure in a population. Now, in such a projection model, there are many parameters that need to be estimated. For example, the parameter that tells something about the relationship between urbanization and the changing age structure in a country. Now, to estimate these kind of parameters for each country in the world, because we want to come up with methodology for each country in the world. To estimate those parameters for each country in the world, and for all Asian countries, it might be tricky to do because data might be limited. The number of data points in the past on urbanization might be limited. To overcome this difficulty, we want to use what we call a Bayesian hierarchical model to estimate the parameters of the projection model for each country. The idea of this Bayesian hierarchical model is to exchange information between countries. Now, how does that work? For example, if we want to estimate this parameter that gives the relationship between urbanization rate and changing age structure, then to estimate that parameter for each country, instead of estimating it separately for each country, we estimate it in some kind of a joint approach so that information about that parameter is pooled across countries to share information between countries. Now, what's the result of using such an approach? The result is that we'll end up with not just one trajectory of future urbanization, but a whole sample, a whole set, a whole range of future trajectories. So instead of a one best guess, we get probabilistic projections of urbanization. So an illustration of that, some preliminary results of urbanization projections for, in this case, China and India. So to say a little bit more about the plot. On the vertical axis is the proportion urban in both countries, and on the horizontal axis is time. The black dots are the observed proportion urban given by the national definitions in both countries, and the blue line gives the UN estimates and projections. So, for example, in China, around now, urbanization level is around 40%. Now, what we added to the plots are our preliminary results of using a Bayesian hierarchical model to project urbanization. So the gray lines you see in the back are different future possible trajectories of urbanization in both countries. That gives a range of likely outcomes. With this technique, we still can give users one best guess of what's going to happen based on the median outcome of the trajectory in each year, which I illustrated here with the red line. Now, the dashed lines, the green dashed line and the red dashed line, also give some quantification of uncertainty in the future by so-called projection intervals, which contain a certain percentage of the future trajectories. So in this case, 95% of the trajectories and 80% of the trajectories. So what do we see here? We see for China, we project urbanization to go up to 75% by 2100, and in India to 50% by 2100. Of course, these are preliminary results, and probably everybody in the audience has something to criticize about these results. For example, in China, you see some trajectories in which urbanization falls from 75 to 30% in like 15 years. So maybe you don't like that. Well, we don't like it either, so we're happy with this project because we want to improve on these methods. So then to come back to the big picture. So GIS research activities, they're related to say urbanization in Asia, city growth, sustainable cities. In order to carry out those research activities, we need reliable estimates and projections of urban and city populations. And as Kevin pointed out, there are serious problems with estimates and projections of both, and with comparability between those estimates of different countries and cities. So we want to improve on those. Specifically, and maybe that's unique about this project, we will work closely with the United Nations Population Division to improve its database and methodology. So the UN publishes the World Urbanization Prospects every 2 years. Our methods that we develop ultimately would be part of that machinery to come up with those revised estimates and projections every 2 years. So that then would put GI in the international playing field of urbanization and city growth projection methodology. Now this is a 2-year project. What would be the medium-term potential of this project? Of course, with more and more spatial data and methodology to analyze the data becoming available, doing spatial analyses and projections of these populations would be an obvious next step. So we want to explore this during the next 2 years already, and For longer-term potential, we would want to and need to collaborate with other people at NUS or maybe other universities. Then the second medium-term potential is to expand this project. So I already discussed doing a study of projection methods being used in the region. We could extend this study to include more cities in more countries. Also, or moreover, if we work hard on including uncertainty assessments in our projections, in our city projections, then the next step would be to actually do something with those uncertainty assessments when it comes to policy making. So we would like to collaborate with city planners so that they can use uncertainty in the projections in their planning, so in their planning decisions. So this concludes our presentation on our project. So we welcome your comments, questions, suggestions, discussion, and so on. Thank you.
It's open for discussion. If you haven't already introduced yourself when you ask a question, I'd appreciate it if you would give your name and affiliation. Presented.
I have one comment and one question. You see, when you talked about how the problem in estimating what is a city has to do with political problems, right? There are political imperatives. There are different political goals for suburbs to call themselves cities, right? This, I don't know how much of a problem this you estimate this will be when you go to do your projections and measurements, you know, will the politics interfere? But more importantly, when you make your recommendations, will you build in that political consideration, that there may be resistance to your categorization because there are other interests involved? Secondly, my question is, how do you seek to delineate or bound the question of boundaries, these mega-urban regions as cities? And I heard somewhere that you were going to use different parameters, and that may be the best one, but how are you doing it?
Yeah, thanks for that. The political aspects are clearly very important. I mean, the example that I gave of Thailand and Philippines illustrates them well, because in Thailand, one reason why there is an underestimate of urban areas is that you have to be, or in the past you had to be declared a municipal area in order to be considered urban, and that had all sorts of implications for fiscal and tax policies and so on, and the wealth of the administration of those areas. So, yeah, we're well aware of that. But even more so that these things do change, because in Thailand there was a decision to modify that, and in terms of what is considered an urban area. And so now some areas that are not officially municipal areas are considered urban by the planners. Those are the sanitary districts. So, yeah, these things change, and also it's very hard to predict how they will change over time. And this is part of the issue, that you're sort of looking at a moving target, so to speak, because of changes in definitions that will take place. So, yes, we have to draw that to the attention of people we're working with, and have to admit that nobody, has this crystal ball of predicting exactly what political changes will lead to different definitions over time. That's beyond what we can do. Your question about the boundaries of these mega urban regions. Yes, as we found in the study that I referred to, I mean, these are infinitely variable, but we did come up with boundaries based on some criteria of density and proportion of workforce in agriculture and so on, then related to the administrative districts for which you were able to get data from the censuses. So you can decide on the boundaries according to certain criteria. You can modify the boundaries by modifying the criteria. So that's basically the way that it goes.
I guess just, if I may just respond briefly, I guess the issue is it would be very useful in your study to also mention what are the political factors involved in this problem of defining the city.
Absolutely, yes.
I'm reminded of an instance where some years ago I read an article about Houston, Texas, and those of you who know the state of Texas will understand this immediately, that this announcement was made that Houston is now the biggest city in the United States. And they had managed to accrete a very large area, and indeed it was the largest city in terms of area, and it happened by a vote of the council or something. So it just underscores what you're dealing with. Question here, please.
Thank you, Gavin and Leonita. My name is Angelique Chan from Department of Sociology, and as a demographer/sociologist, I really appreciate the project. I'd like to go back to one of your slides where you talked about the urban-rural divide having it's important for differentiating populations in terms of well-being, and access to health and education services. And I wondered how much of the project, in addition to doing these probabilistic estimations, will include linking in with these different measures of well-being.
Yes, this is something that's certainly very, very close to my heart. We don't want to promise too much for this project. That it's encompassing so much work already that it's easy for me to say, yes, we'll do this and we'll do that. But I think that one area that we want to look at is, when we talk of gradations from rural to urban and so on, it's been argued, and some of the research I've done also shows that the peri-urban rural areas are really very different in all kinds of characteristics from the more isolated and inaccessible rural areas that we tend to think of as truly rural. And in terms of this continuum, there are many implications for the provision of government services in terms of, say, health, education facilities, transportation facilities, and all the rest of it. So we do want to look at this more, the issue of how do you really look at this gradation of rural areas, and certainly very interested in it, but the question is just how much can be done within the life of the project, I think, on that.
Mike Douglas from University of Hawaii. I'm here as a visiting senior research fellow at ARI, and Gavin's already mentioned I was part of that project that we did on mega-urban regions. As a note about politics, I think Hanoi, starting with an H, has trumped Houston. It is now doubled its population by tripling or more than tripling the size of its municipal boundaries overnight, in competition with Ho Chi Minh City as the dominant city in the country, and it's totally politically done. What I want to raise is the question of history and how that's going to be brought into demographic projections or population projections. What is, Gavin and I were talking the other day about events and episodes that we couldn't have predicted 20, 30 years ago. One of the major ones now in the world is shrinking cities. According to some estimates, half the cities in the world are actually declining in population. This is not easily predictable in kind of curvilinear projections of the past. If I look at East and Southeast Asia, the number one source of that is the rise of China. And if you look at countries like Japan or Korea or Taiwan, their secondary cities are starting to depopulate because of the shift of industry from them to China. This was not, even 10 or 15 years ago, perhaps, this was not on the charts. And if you go to a city like Daegu or Kaohsiung or several others, you'll find that the number one source of their growth, particularly in Kaohsiung, is foreign workers. So we have the rise of multicultural cities that are not, these people are not included in the national census, the major shift in population. So I want to invite you to go beyond the population of the United Nations folks and get some people who look at cities from an economic point of view or global regional point of view. I think you'll have a much more accurate understanding of which cities are going to be growing in the future and which aren't. The cities that are not growing are really in crisis. They have no idea what to do with their economies. And the local planners know this. So getting those local planners on board very early would be very important too. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we really value those comments. And I mean, one thing is to examine in more detail in the countries that we're looking at in detail the things that are going on. And as you say, that involves including the economic planners and those who are looking at globalization more broadly. But I'd also want to stress the point you made, the unpredictability of so much of this, and in the future, do we predict that in 20 years' time some of these cities will still be losing investment to China, which itself is going to be facing a rapidly declining workforce at that point. So there are all sorts of difficult things to predict here, and we recognize this just makes the task very much harder. But I think the basic point you're making is that we need to be involved with those who are looking at the economic determinants of industrial change and so on, and yeah, we would agree.
My name is Duan Jinquan. I'm from Risk Management Institute. I have two questions. First, your study using some sort of boundary definition.
Can you use the
okay. And I have two questions. One is your study touch upon the boundary definition, a boundary of urban area, and I will presume the boundary will be an endogenous process. In particular, in your projection, I was wondering how that play into your projection. Second question I have is about your methodological advancement in terms of probabilistic projection, and you gave us a confidence band of possibilities. But then I say there are two issues. One issue is it's not very easy to use, right? If you just give me a pass of point-wise projection, as a planner, I can really quite easily use it, although we know there's a problem because of the confidence. The other thing is a reality. You gave us such a big confidence span. How can we have any confidence in using it? So I think that's sort of counterproductive in some sense.
I'll address the first question, and Leontina will turn to the second one. On the first one, yes, I mean, one of the key things you observe with any large city over time, you do get these boundary changes, and so you have these discontinuities in projections which need to be taken into account. And I mean, it's not just a boundary change that's totally arbitrary. To some extent, it's reflecting reality. I mean, the urban agglomerations are getting bigger, and it becomes recognized through boundary changes. But, this is something that really needs to be studied very carefully in the case of any of the cities involved, I think.
Yes, about the usage of probabilistic projections, I agree with you that it is challenging. It's challenging to communicate uncertainty, and it's challenging to explain to policymakers what to actually do with it. I would like to respond is, first of all, we still have our one best projection. Even if we make it probabilistic, we still get the one best projection. In terms of the benefit of having the uncertainty assessment, giving the additional information, there's research being done on how to actually use that. And you can, for example, if you can discuss with the users of the projections how they will use their projection. So what I'm familiar with so far is projecting populations, looking at birth rates. And in these kind of projections, the lower bound of the projections are actually much more important than the one best guess scenario. So finding out from policymakers, are they interested in a lower bound or an upper bound, things like that, then you can actually provide such a bound to the policymakers. And then to your last point, in terms of the prediction intervals that I showed, they were like really, really wide. Yes, that's not that useful. So hopefully we can improve on that, and we can come up with a more realistic range of future trajectories.
Thank you. Bernard?
Bernard Tan, Physics Department. I know most of the data will be based on populations and all that, but I was wondering how much physical data you would be using. I happen to be closely associated with the Remote Sensing Center, so there is a wealth of data that we might not obtain any other way. So would you be using that sort of data? And because we can help to make that available for you.
Thank you. This is something we didn't mention, but which we are certainly looking into. And in fact, we're going to be having discussions in New York with. There's a large project there which is using gridded data and the data from satellite imagery and things like that. There's a great deal, certainly, that can be done with that these days in terms of sort of defining boundaries and so on. What it doesn't have, of course, is the detailed data on things like employment and all the rest of it, which you'd want to link with it. But yeah, we would very much like to discuss that further with you.
Banaji Rao, I'm the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It's fascinating to hear that at last we are probably moving away from high projection, medium projection, low projection to quantifying probabilities. But as you know, Professor Jones, we always used to look at, I'm talking from the 60s onwards, we used to look at the high projection, low projection, medium projection, and use the medium projection. And so I do echo the earlier comments. It may be useful if, in terms of extremely valuable value addition, if you actually look at Shanghai, Beijing, Mumbai, Delhi, and then say, look, you guys, you better prepare for this eventuality. Because I'm not quite comfortable looking at the probabilities for percentage of urban in India, percent urban in China, etc. As you know very well, I think GAI will be branded extremely well if GAI research in this particular field could at least focus on some of the major cities. And then you have already nicely highlighted that you are in fact going to look at the urban planners using the numbers from their own stable. So I would request you to kindly include some sort of detailed analysis of the megacities. And I think that may be much more useful in terms of policymakers in major countries, especially China and India. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Yes, we are intending to do that. There are really two prongs to the study, and one is looking at urbanization, the proportion urban, which you were saying is maybe not as useful, but the other prong is the attention to individual cities, and so I hope that we'll go at least some way towards achieving what you're talking about. Well, at the minimum, we're looking at the Jakarta-Bandung complex, the Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, probably Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi, and a couple of the cities in India, which would probably be Mumbai and Delhi and maybe Bangalore. We have a colleague in China who's worked with us on the earlier project, and he is willing to be involved in the project, but is concerned that the data availability from the census won't have come through. So, but one other thing that could be done for China, and particularly by this colleague, would be to look at some of these smaller cities in relation to the big one that he's already looked at, which was Shanghai. And as Mike was saying, some of the smaller cities all over the place are in decline, and we need to be looking at some of those as well. I don't want to promise too many cities, because with the manpower and the time that we have, to promise too much might be unwise.
I may have missed this in your presentation. One of the interesting parts is the fact of how many different definitions there are, and I think a strength of the project is you're sensitive to this and you're working closely with the agencies that do these definitions. I'm wondering if you expect to come out of the project, though, with a statement of what you think better and worse definitions of urbanization will be? And would those definitions be linked to the fact that for one class of problems, one characterization of urbanization might be appropriate, and for another class of problems, perhaps a different characterization? Is that would be a really valuable insight from all these different perspectives that the project is scanning.
Yes, I mean we would definitely hope to come out of it with observations about what definition or definitional mix, you might say, would be more appropriate for various purposes. And as you've said, what definition is more appropriate may vary according to the purposes of the exercise. So, yeah, we would want to try to say something about that, having worked on all of this.
Hi, I'm Tim Bunnell from the Asia Research Institute and the Department of Geography. My question also has to do with issues of definition. And it seems like what you're seeking to work towards is some kind of it seems like what you're trying to work towards is some kind of unified or standardized definition of the urban. But my concern is that actually doesn't do justice to the diversity of urban forms and urban experiences. So much of your definitional consideration had to do with distinctions between the rural and urban. There's a huge literature on that, of course. But even if you come up with a generalized definition of what constitutes the urban as distinct from the rural, that within that category of the urban, there are all kinds of different experiences, diversity which partly relates to what Michael Douglas was talking about. I think the experiences of a shrinking city are very different from one of a fast expanding megacity. And indeed, a shrinking city may have more commonalities in terms of life chances.
I think your mic went off.
So it may have more similarities with rural areas than it does with other cities. So I'm not dismissing the project at all. I think I can see that there's utility in this idea of unifying definition, but I also think that perhaps you might want to consider the possibility of there being a diversity of forms of urban experience. And we know that Asia is important in terms of its urbanization, in terms of absolute numbers, but it's also extremely important in terms of its diverse urban forms of experience.
Yes, thank you for that. I think we are sort of being pulled two ways in this. I mean, our gut feeling is that there is this enormous diversity in urban forms, and also this continuum in urban-rural areas, and to look for a single unified definition in some ways seems to be, a strange way to go. But the fact is that the projections of urbanization are there. They're being used by the United Nations to the extent that they can be improved in various ways. They are being used and are going to be used by all sorts of users. So I think that's important. At the same time, I fully agree with you that we need to be looking at the diversity of experiences, and in the individual case studies that we're doing, of course, we'll be looking at that. I mean, in the studies that we've already done, you see enormous diversity within these mega-urban regions in terms of growth and decline of particular areas, simultaneously juxtaposition of growing and declining areas, and examining why that is. This will all be part of what we aim to do.
Thank you, Professor Jones and Professor Akima. We now move on to today's final presentation, Asian Cities as Centers of Global Modernity. This research project combines the expertise of researchers within the field of humanities and social sciences. I would now like to call upon Professor Petrovic from the Department of Sociology to introduce this project.
Nice pictures of Shanghai and Singapore. Potential centers of global modernity. I'd like to introduce this project by talking about how theory can be directly relevant and useful to policymakers. And it probably is more difficult to introduce this project than many others, or especially the two that just came in terms of direct relevance for policymaking, so that's why I want to start with this. And I want to paraphrase Sitaram here, saying that about valuable commodities and a gift of God. Well, we want to emphasize that a good theory is an extremely valuable commodity. And it's not a gift of God, and should be thought about this way. And it's especially important to understand this at certain historical moments, and that's key part of our presentation here. It's basically that we assume that social changes don't happen in some kind of linear, even way. That they happen much faster at certain periods, so we have some certain types of transitions, bifurcations, major changes, and we do have periods when things solidify, crystallize for a while. Well, the assumption here is that social theory, general social theory, can be most valuable for policymakers at the times when we're just finishing a transition period of rapid change, and entering a period where things still do change, but there is also, we can see some things being solidified and crystallized. Why is this the case? Well, decision makers do what they do best, and we don't have an assumption that we can tell them how to make their decisions. They're experts on that. But what theorists can do is they have a comparative advantage of not having to make decisions all the time. So we can sit back and look at broader picture because we have more time to do so. So in that case, it's extremely important to have general theory, general framework, when things have changed, but are maybe not bound to change as rapidly in next 10, 15, 20 years. And also, which is very relevant for Asian cities, as long as you think about them as entities that are catching up, that are modeling themselves toward the Western model or some other model, then you have, in a sense, clear path ahead. You're catching up. Once they come to the forefront of change, then there is more uncertainty, because you cannot rely on an existing model. Okay, so this is the introduction of a project. Project is, as it says here, focused on creating a general historical comparative framework for the analysis of Asian cities. So in that sense, it doesn't address any particular policy problem. Rather, it addresses the context in which policy problems will be formulated, we expect, in next 5, 10, or 15 years. Okay, here's the overview of the project. At the top, you have our theory, our framework, and there are two prongs to it. What I call differentiation theoretical analysis, which defines main features of global modernity, this new era that we are talking about, and the world historical analysis, which traces the rise of modern cities as center-periphery structures, not just Asian cities, but modern big cities in general. So I will focus on some of this in following slides, because this is, in a sense, what we know so far. This is what we start with. Our empirical research focus, and I'll introduce this after that, is on actor network analysis of Asian cities as emerging centers of global modernity. Our research outcomes I will not talk much about because we don't have them yet, but I will suggest how some of those might be directly relevant to GAI focus. Now, starting with differentiation theoretical analysis, this is a very brief primer for both social scientists and non-social scientists here. We have two major types of social differentiation here. That's the theoretical framework we use. We have on the left functional differentiation as the master process of modernity, and which basically refers to formation of separate institutional realms. Note here that I put a bunch of realms. Typical analysis we'll do with economy, politics, and the residual realm that we can call society or culture or something like that. Here we have actually more realms, and there is quite a bit of importance to this. I'll come to this in the next slide. Before that, let me just mention that then the other aspect of differentiation theoretical analysis is organizational differentiation that we're all more familiar with. And here I would also like to divide it into functionally specific organizations. I listed some examples. And what I called here total organizations, in which nation states probably will be the major examples, but I'll give a few more examples. Now, the outcome of those differentiation processes are what the central one that we'll be focusing on, modern center-periphery structures, and that will come back to what Gavin was just talking about in a previous presentation, and also things that we will be addressing, but somewhat peripheral in this project, modern forms of inclusion and exclusion, and changes in modern interactions and life worlds. Now, going to functional differentiation part. Again, very brief, just about the idea, and I think one of the advantages of this idea is that it links well with natural sciences, with sciences in general. It is quite translatable between fields. And the idea is, it has been formulated in many ways in social sciences, but the newest and we hope best formulations that we have so far think about institutional realms like economy or politics, not as containers, as boxes that we can divide society into, but as attractor points. So in that sense, they form around different types of generalized media. In terms of economy, it will be money-property complex. Once you start using money historically to a great degree, and that's a relatively recent phenomenon when you think world historically, all kinds of organizations can latch onto this. All kinds of consumer motivations, production motivations can develop and be comparable to each other. The same thing, for example, with education. Once you redefine modern education as transformation of human being and in terms of national goals, all kinds of organizations can develop and all kinds of individual motivations can develop around it. So in that sense, there is no predetermined number of these realms. We have formation of these realms happening in the last 20, 30, 40 years. People have analyzed formation of sport as a differentiated institutional realm, health as a differentiated institutional realm. And important thing at the bottom of the left column here is they do not work together or serve somehow the rest of society. Now, on the right-hand column, talking about individual inclusion, realms, unlike organizations, are all-inclusive, but they do not rely on membership. You are not a member of economy or politics, but you're expected to be oriented toward this in different aspects of your life. That's why inclusion is always partial. Being a consumer, you're also expected to be a citizen. You're also expected to be aware of legal norms or to pursue certain type of educational self-actualization. So as individual organizational actors participate in these realms, they develop generalized identities around those. Identity of a consumer, of a citizen, of a legal subject, and so on. Okay, this all still sounds very abstract. Don't worry, I'll come to more concrete examples of this in a while. Looking at the second part of our differentiation theoretical framework, organizational differentiation and the center-periphery structures, it leads to what we have, in a sense, in evolutionary terms, social evolutionary terms, is that as functional differentiation, division into those separate institutional realms, dissolves old hierarchical structures. It also leads to proliferation both of mass inclusion organizations, territorially based, like states and city-states and other different types of regional identities, ethno-linguistically based, religious-based, and even work criteria, as Marx put great hope in it in the 19th century, that that will be the major identity, will all be divided into classes rather than tribes or nations. You also have even higher proliferation of realm-specific organizations, though that orient themselves toward a specific realm. It doesn't mean that the firm can ignore political or legal constraints, but it means that the firm can say, well, our profits or the value for stakeholders, if you want more fanciful formulation, comes first. The same about these other organizations orienting themselves to a specific realms. Through the processes of competition, cooperation, diffusion, and replication of these organizations, new types of center-periphery structures arise. Okay. Now we come to the more empirical part of it. The idea is, as we just heard in the previous presentation, that what a city is changes over time. In different historical periods, definition of a city is very different, and we are not looking at the same entity exactly. And again, comes to also this temporal uncertainty, I'll come to this in a second, is that, well, 30 years ago, we might have thought about cities very differently, and it's not a simple process of discovering something new, it's that actual entity that we're looking at changed dramatically in its nature. So, two types of those center-periphery structures are states, two major types that I'll be addressing now. States that, as I pose here, evolve gradually from national communities to very loose coupling of multi-level government agencies, and when I say multi-level, we can think about regional, national, transnational, and so on levels. And cities that evolve from communities, from container-type cities, in our perception, to very loose agglomerations of multiple centers. And hence, things like economic defined cities, political defined cities, municipalities, right? Cities defined in terms of educational accessibility and so on, become different types of overlapping maps or overlapping structures. Two methodological implications for this. One is that countries might not be such useful units to analyze all this. That's why I put this as methodological globalism. Second line here does not assume the existence and importance of national territorial societies. Again, this is an empirical question. In some cases, what governments do, or what some kind of common ethnicity or culture presumably surviving for a long time might influence, that's very strong influence. In some cases, there is very little influence. Different types of such social closure prevail in different periods. So when we think about this, again, I was just looking at the previous presentation. There was one map there, this very common map, and I think is singularly misleading. We see, for example, Russia being 70% urbanized in 2045. And of course, it covers huge area on the map, including Siberia, right? And then if we would plot it with remote sensing, let's say, then we would see flickers of light here and there, and all concentrated in pretty much on the western border of Russia, right? So in this sense, this is the first kind of spatial social aspect. The other aspect, which is very important, that was also alluded to in previous presentation, and even in first presentation on diabetes, is that things change quite rapidly, and they don't change evenly. It means that the importance of periodization is critical, that what cities mean, what families mean now might not have been the same in 1970s and 80s, and there is no simple evolutionary process linking those, that there are major transitions and bifurcation periods. So this, the quote there about the 3 times of the present is, I just want to mention it, is one of my favorite from St. Augustine, early Catholic thinker, right, Christian thinker, who said, well, 3 types of the present. There is the present of the past, present of the present, and present of the future. It's pointing to, we always see it from our own present. Okay, now coming to our world historical analysis, the idea, to remind you here, is to provide a general framework for reformulation of problems that face Asia in the next 15-20 years, especially related to urban areas and cities. Periodization is the bottom here, and again, it's very rough, but it kind of indicates graphically this shortening of the presence. The present that we live in, we try to indicate, is the present of global modernity. We can also call it post-Western modernity. Not essentially post-Western in the sense that it will keep defining itself as post-Western, but post-Western looking toward the past. It's not necessarily just Western modernity anymore. It's not about catching up. It's a polycentric modernity today. Some of those Asian cities, many of them perhaps, can be role models of global modernity for Western and non-Western cities, thus erasing the major difference between the West and the rest. So shortening of the presence and the major transition that we pose, we have just gone through in the last 20 years or so. Major part of this was the rise of Asia and acceleration of change. Again, this is the world historical picture we tend to plot. Again, non-Asian cities in yellow, Asian cities in red, and just kind of indicating the numbers. Major mega regions, urban areas, agglomerations, however you want to define them, they're there. All right, so what is this global modernity that I've been mentioning, the new period, the new age I'm assuming we should think about, and this is our present? Well, starting from about 9 o'clock there, inclusion thresholds. That's something that previous presentation addresses directly, right? Urbanization, what are the levels? However we define it, whether it's country level, whether it's the size of a mega city, it means that more and more people, more and more individuals are urbanized. It defines the inclusion threshold, and United Nations are fond of pointing, well, we just became 50% urban. Well, it depends on your definition. But definitely it's increasing. It's accelerating and changing the experiences of major part of global population. Same with education. Looking at UNESCO statistics on education, we see major acceleration in the last 20 years. We see that countries like Sudan, with second lowest educational participation in primary schools today, actually is higher than European countries were in 1950s, Western European countries. So again, we see this major acceleration in the last 20 years. Part of it is political manipulation, we know this, but also part of it is real. Going down around counterclockwise, polycentricity and networks, I'll come to this in the next slide, but the idea is that we really think about cities now as agglomerations, as realm-specific agglomerations, economic, political, not as communities or containers. This allows for interactional proliferation. Good example is this meeting, right? This is a meeting that, according to GAI, is supposed to increase collaboration. We should think about interaction as those kind of circuit breakers, when people from different disciplines in this case, but also people from different, oriented toward different realms, economists, politicians, scientists, and so on, can actually achieve a circuit break between realms. That's what organizations do, and that's what interactions do even more intensely. Reduction of non-contemporaneity, it's obvious today through internet and through many other channels. We basically are contemporaries. What happens in Singapore today will be posted on the internet. We're here for hundreds of thousands of people to see what's happening in this room. So in that sense, again, this is something fairly new. 20 to 30 years at most, and probably less. Acceleration of change I already mentioned, and next slide we'll talk about leapfrogging. Organizational proliferation, there's lots of good statistics on this. There is massive organizational proliferation, again accelerating from about 1980s on. First wave of acceleration from about 1945, 1950 related to decolonization, and then after that from 1980s on. So again, the general idea here is that something has changed. We live in a period that is not, we couldn't have foreseen in 1970s, 1980s, and it's somewhat unrecognizable. Now coming to our focus, and that's addressing a question about megacities, big cities. Yes, there are huge problems about small cities and shrinking cities. We chose in this project to focus on megacities for obvious reasons. They might be centers of global modernity. So we list here some of those, 2 from China, well, 3 from China, including Hong Kong. We want 2 from India, 2 Southeast Asian, and, well, a 3rd Southeast Asian, our own Singapore. By 2025, again, we're shortening the horizon. Some of these cities are likely to become new centers and role models of global modernity. Here I'd like just to draw your attention to this quote about leapfrogging. So this is Kenneth Ware, US Senator, 1940. We will lift Shanghai up and up. Well, we will not think about Senator Ware as ignorant Midwesterner. Not at all. What he was pointing there is actually somewhat ironic. He didn't say we will lift it so it looks like New York. He said even Kansas City at this time looks better than the cosmopolitan major Asian city like Shanghai. And he was pointing exactly to this, so there is actually a twist to that thing. Now there is Kansas City in 2008. Well, they looked somewhat similar, but huge difference of scale that I couldn't really present here. Some data about Shanghai that you are all, I'm sure, familiar with. The point here is that Shanghai had about $15,000 per capita income, which is about 3 times less than US average at purchasing power parity, and about 6 times less than Boston or Seattle, as some of the most affluent American cities have, is able to stage massive Shanghai Expo and is able to do all of these things. So that's talking about leapfrogging. You have some legacy issues. Microsoft might be the most aware of this organization in the world. You have legacy issues that you have to take care of. And that allows other similar entities in the mutually observed network to leapfrog in many senses. Now, talking about income per capita, not the most important variable, but something that shows about resources. In the leftmost column, you have different world cities at 2008. And you see very rich ones at the top. And this is 73,000 for New York, 73,000 US dollars purchasing power parity per capita. You have quite rich ones, Paris, Miami, Sydney, that's about 40 to 60, Madrid to the bottom of this. You have not so affluent ones, but definitely aspiring, Lisbon, Athens, Budapest, and then goes all the way down to 20. Asian cities in 2008, if you compare Singapore, for example, or Hong Kong, the 2 most affluent ones, you'll see that they're still comparable to many Western cities, but quite lower than American cities. Now, what I want to draw attention to is the absolute terms. When we look at the 3rd projected column, and this is based partly on PricewaterhouseCoopers estimations, partly on UN Habitat ones, we see that Singapore and Hong Kong are projected to be in this very affluent category. Well, yes, by that time, Boston or Seattle will be about 100,000. But that doesn't matter. We're talking about absolute resources that you have. And we saw that even at 15,000, Shanghai in the middle column, you can do major things and become a role model in many senses. And then you can see that those will be moving up into this kind of relatively affluent category where your values change and where resources can become more massive, and if they're focused properly, you can really do something about becoming the role model of global modernity. Okay, very briefly about our empirical research. After creating this framework, which hopefully will be useful for many different projects, we plan to analyze major actor networks in these 8 cities around the region two ones as kind of control factors, Tokyo and Seoul, but we'll focus on these 8 that I mentioned. And basically find, because what it takes really is not just a change in income per capita, not just the amount of skyscrapers. It takes, as it says down there, it takes a successful coalition of major stakeholders. We'll try to compare those in terms of which forces, which modernity makers might be there and what their orientations are. Both in terms of governance, which is the main UN World Bank focus, but mostly in terms of those interactions, circuit breakers, organizational interactions between stakeholders and programs from different realms. So just draw a diabetes example. Well, how is food and beverage industry going to be a player in addressing diabetes? What's in it for them? Here around modernity, it may be a major mobilizing factor, but we have to think about different realms and their dynamics. Finally, the last slide is about research outcomes, and I just put them in cascading order from the most general to, or in a sense, most theoretical to most practical, and then kind of match them with some things that I drew from GI brochure, GI vision, how we matched it. Again, this is just some idea how the framework might be useful. What I'd like to draw attention to, because this GAI-funded project is a part of something that we are doing, several of us are doing also as a larger project of defining global modernity. There will be a September workshop at NUS about this, not related directly to GAI. And this will be the showcase, we hope, of this building global modernity as a paradigm. But one thing in terms of catching up and leapfrogging, one thing that we in social sciences were talking about across disciplines and areas is that, well, NUS is definitely a leader in Asian research and becoming a very respected global university, or has become already. But what it lacks in, especially in social sciences, are paradigms, schools associated with it as kind of brands. And again, this might seem like superficial marketing ploy, but I think it's very important if some of these Asian universities, including NUS as one of the best of them, are going to establish themselves on the world scale, they need to have something associated with them as a brand. And again, whether this will happen or not, it's our hope that it will with this particular one, but we think it has some potential. Thank you.
You say there that what you're seeking to do, in part, is to consider whether these cities have what it takes to successfully modernize. And to me, that raises absolutely a crucial question as how do we define success? What constitutes success? I mean, do we think about success in terms of the ability to serially replicate these kinds of iconic skyscrapers that we see in all these city skylines? Or do we think about success in terms of the kind of things that Mike Douglas has been talking about, which is the possibility for human interaction, civic spaces, sites of sociability? It strikes me as absolutely crucial here to consider what definition of success you're working with, and in particular, whose definition of success are you working with?
Well, I have two answers to one question. So I absolutely agree. It is crucial to define what success is. On the very general level, we're actually not trying to define this. What we're trying is to create a framework, something quite similar to what the second team was doing, trying to create framework of possible trajectories and futures in which decision makers will define what the criteria of success are there. Again, we may have some preferred ones or not as a team, but it's not up to us to define the normative, the value part of it. But the framework will define, in a sense, hopefully in a broad sense, so that some of these questions can be raised. Right? The second question, yes, we do focus in this specific project on the role models of global modernity, which will push our definition toward, well, maybe not necessarily iconic skyscraper, but that's one of the aspects of global modernity, definitely a symbolic spatial aspect. Other things that can be defined in a process like percentage of green spaces, sustainable technologies, livable cities, they will definitely come into play because they're already there in the play. What we're trying to define is kind of the broader picture of this. How do we get here when we define those problems as crucial? And what are just things that are about to happen? Next 10, 15 years, what are some of the options that we may have? And that's the answer.
Just, I love the example you used because I grew up just outside of Kansas City. And I was going to say, in my lifetime, it has always looked pretty much as it looks now, or as it looks in that picture. And a second thing is that the town that I grew up in just adopted the Singapore math curriculum for primary and secondary schools. So those two things, though, go to the point that I think I like the project, but I would urge you to maybe shift the thinking around the project a little bit to say Asian cities are centers of global modernity. It's not a question of someday, maybe, can we see, will they become them? They are. So the point is maybe thinking more in terms of what does it mean to be a center of global modernity? How do they work as centers of global modernity? And in terms of being role models, what are the implications of them as role models? Because I think, I especially working in Malaysia, which has always had this Vision 2020 thing, and like, how are we ever going to catch up with the West and blah, blah, blah. It's already happened. Not in every respect and all measures, but in some ways it has. So then shifting, you see what I'm saying about shifting the focus?
Yeah, I don't think it requires much to answer. I agree with this. We're trying to be modest here and talk about 2025. But then again, if I knew that you grew up outside of Kansas City, I would have included more nostalgic pictures of it, not just 2008. But the idea is that some of the Western cities are definitely also in competition, and that's the idea of polycentric character, that whether it's Asian or Western matters very little now. And those things change. There is a new regime in which they constantly observe each other and adopt best practices. And so, yes, New York will be learning from Shanghai, as Shanghai is learning from New York, and it is very hard to predict that Asian cities will dominate or Western cities will be second. I think we have, instead of country or region-based analysis now, we have those city networks, and all of them will compete and evolve with each other. And again, we will probably not dare to predict that cities from one region or the other region will become more dominant. But definitely, point well taken. Some of the Asian cities, symbolically, iconically, and socially, might be already role models, as definitely is true for Singapore and the Middle East or other Asian countries.
I'm quite struck by what you call the framework that you are using, basically, to come up with this, this whole idea of how one could think about Asian cities as centers of global modernity. Now, there's one key aspect that you are talking about, which is what you call world historical analysis. And you also use the notion of center and periphery. These are quite an amazing, to me, an appropriation of what we know as a world system analysis. And then in some ways, the basic idea behind this world historical analysis is that the formations of global modernity is based on the dispossessions of many other places in the world. And there's no discussion on that aspect. And that is what seems to be disturbing. This idea of you use this theory, but yet at the same time you don't really address the central message of that particular historical approach to the city. Thanks.
Yeah, that is partly not basing our analysis on world system, Wallersteinian style. Again, since we have all kinds of scientists here, when we are with our fellow social scientists, then we throw names at each other. But I didn't want to do this deliberately, and you're right to recognize part of it. It's a slightly different analysis in theoretical terms. However, in substantive terms, which is the main part, I believe, of your question, where are the excluded? Where are the dispossessed in this analysis? And as I pointed on one of the slides, multiple forms of exclusion come up with functional differentiation, and it's in a sense more evil type of exclusion than exclusion in a, let's say, very hierarchical society, where you can be at the bottom but you know your place, and in that sense you can try to renegotiate that place in a sense. In a multiple differentiated society, you can be excluded simultaneously from, and it happens quite often, economy, politics, education, so on. So we have this very interesting inclusion-exclusion structures, interesting from a scientific point and very painful in terms of human suffering. This is not necessarily the main focus of our project. It is indicative, obviously, that these megacities have slum areas, not necessarily in Singapore, at least officially, but definitely in Mumbai, which is about 60%. and in Chinese cities too. Again, this is something that the framework hopefully will put as a major gap there to fit into the analysis. Our initial thing for 2.5 years and $250,000, as Gavin pointed out, it's a limited sum of money, is to define something along that central axis that we pointed out is how some of the cities redefine themselves as role models of global modernity. Now the underside of this, which might be intrinsic or might be accidental, historically accidental, is definitely something that will fit well as a complementary project. And again, we definitely don't want to exclude it as something that is not happening, but it's just not the main focus of our project right now.
As a very subsidiary co-PI on this, I think I should also respond to some of the comments which go quite straight to my heart, since I do identify myself with the substantive excluded. I don't identify myself, but I identify with, I guess. And I really think that this project is in some ways looking at a very basic methodological issue of how we can understand, and ultimately for me it is how we can understand poverty in increasing modernity and exclusions in increasing modernity, and but to understand it better than I think had been with the earlier theoretical models we've had. And here, for me, there's some very simple structures here, although it's a very complex, elaborate model. But there are very simple driving methodological factors. One is the issue of differentiation, that you constantly get institutional differentiation that tends to become global. It's not just national or doesn't respect limits. But the other part of it is that, and which I think Misha's had used a rather more complex ways to do it, is coordination. Because in fact, in a city, what you need to have with increasing differentiation, with different types of organizations coming, advocating and so on, you also need forms of coordination. And to some extent, a city nerve center is that form of coordination. And how do you sort of do that? What kind of format do you use for coordinations and so on? And so that in its ultimate way, and that those forms of coordination will have to address these new types of inclusions and exclusions, right? And here it's also very important to have the other dimension, which is the historical background of what it is, what is the spatial context in which cities are emerging in this particular period. I mean, to put it very simply, and Misha put it theoretically, is that you're going from the idea of cities embedded in nested networks, typically from a national model, right? You have cities that have higher order, lower orders in the hierarchy and that are connected with hinterlands within which they are nested. Well, that pattern is also changing now with the global cities theory. The global cities theory shows interactions and intersections and interconnections with other global cities. And in this case, in Asia, one of the things we also hope to look at is regional connections between different global cities and the flows of resources. Well, this then completely refigures that the hinterland issue, right? You're not going to be in that nested model. You're going to have a much more complex system of an hinterland that is interacting also perhaps with the hinterland, a hinterland in Mumbai that may be interacting with a hinterland in Jakarta, right? In some ways via their global connections. And this then also we need to understand how to address those issues, and we want simply to see the differentiation coordination principle at work here to look at issues of inclusion and exclusion, which I think is absolutely central. And I don't think that, from my point of view, traditional Marxist notions will not be able to address these issues of inclusion and exclusion simply.
Speaking of inclusion, I get kind of chills when I hear key stakeholders. Isn't everyone who lives in the city a stakeholder? In other words, is this going to be a kind of elitist approach where it's the state and big corporations and academics, or are you going to include non-government organizations, even oppositional groups? in defining best practices. At the end of the day, when you make this kind of report, it's going to have a huge, if it does what you want it to do, it's going to have a huge international impact. This will be the study. And if it's what I perceive as a typical best practice kind of exercise in which only a handful of key stakeholders define it, we're going to end up with the business model of the school, of the city. So it's a question to you. Thank you.
Yes, it's a very good question, and definitely we're hoping to include, when we say all major stakeholders, and yes, it's a well-used and overused buzzword, but that's why we defined it as stakeholders rather than as major organizations or municipal governments or urban planners. And again, the thing is that this process of negotiation over governance is evolving constantly. And 20 years ago, probably we wouldn't think about NGOs as major stakeholders, and now we do. And we can raise this very easily, and again, no one flinched at your question as being unreasonable or, what is this actor that we're talking about? So in that sense, yes, we think about all kinds of nonprofits and NGOs as far as they can command some resources, whether they're symbolic, cultural, or also political and economic, as important stakeholders. So this will be for each of the cities to identify who are the agents of change, who are the agents that can try to define what global modernity is about. Not as presuming that global modernity has to look exactly like this. Hopefully it won't, not because I don't like skyscrapers, but because I hope that all these places will transform in 25, 30 years, just as they transformed in the last 25 or 30 years, toward, again, maybe more green, more livable, more sustainable, or something else that will come along. So in that sense, we'll try to identify who those are, not assuming necessarily that the major ones defined administratively will be the stakeholders.
I think what's interesting about this study is that it's really rich in its qualitative dimensions as much as it is in its quantitative dimensions. And in that spirit, I was struck by the slide labeled World Historical Analysis. And I was wondering why you chose a time frame, especially in the context of Asian cities, that was so short. It seems to me that this study could fall within the tradition of some of the classic rise and fall of civilization studies. In sociology, which is your background, I think of the work of Pitram Sorokin, or my friend Herman Knopflacher, who has looked at cities in Europe, but has put them in a much broader historical study. So I see a real opportunity in this, differentiating it from some of the other valuable things that GAI work is going to do, to situate the study in that tradition and in a much broader spectrum. Just a final point. Lee Kuan Yew, for example, always refers to the Confucian tradition and its role in shaping Singapore's urbanization experience. And I think this study could contribute on those kinds of dimensions, and it would enrich the very fine work that you're doing in a somewhat shorter time horizon at the moment.
I'm very glad that Sorokin's name came about. My first student paper was on Sorokin, so it's very rarely mentioned in social sciences or anywhere else. But in general, yes, I agree with this. If that slide about world historical analysis had a little bit more resolution or was extended toward the left, it would be there. One major idea, though, is that we want to emphasize with methodological modernism that I put on a slide, that the way we interpret Confucianism, or what Asia means, or what China is in a sense always written from the present. And our present is the present of global modernity. So going toward the back, we look at the past as a foreign land, as been said before. So in that sense, we want to reinterpret this. And the question of, for example, the question of origins. where does modernity come from? Well, it's always pointed, well, it's a twin industrial revolution and democratic revolutions. It comes from the West. Well, we constantly reinterpret what modernity means, and those periodizations and chronologies will be reinterpreted. And again, the large scope that we don't want to necessarily throw at GAI and say, well, we'll put it in a 5,000-year perspective of race of urban centers. The large scope will be there at least implicitly. But again, point well taken that civilization analysis is in a sense the background for this.
I don't want to pretend I have understood everything. So you should forgive my comment. First of all, it gives me the impression that some of the Asian cities are evolving to become globally modern. I know that when the project is in the finishing stages, you would educate everybody about what this modernity is all about, how this modernization is defined, blah, blah, blah. I'm a development economist, so you should understand my biases. I'm not sure that there are choices. You know, it gives the impression that here is the city which has all the choice at its disposal and has become a globally modern city. I don't think there are choices. Architects do not give us choices. Employers don't give us choices. If you ask people, why did you migrate to Mumbai in spite of the slums, they say, I don't have a choice. I have to make a living somewhere. My comment is not really very useful to you, but I'm a bit worried that you probably are giving inadvertently an impression that all those people in the globally modernizing cities are extremely happy. I want you to kindly take into account the perspective of the individual in the city vis-a-vis all other dimensions of global modernity, namely the skyscrapers, holding the Olympics, holding the Shanghai Expo, and then Kansas City feeling, looking at Shanghai and telling, wow, look at. So my point and my request to you, sir, is it's a very high-powered team that is doing this research, and my only request to you is do consider this global modernity and the rising Asian cities, what they do to the average individual. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I just want to, yes, the last point, well, I wouldn't want to argue against the average individual and their experiences, but just a comment on choices. I would rather see that there is quite a bit of choices opening up right now because of this process. And in terms of, and choices opening up not necessarily just because we have completely open future, we can do what we want. Obviously, that's not correct. But in terms of functional differentiation, and you said you speak as development economist, and looking from economic perspective, there is rather rigid constraint on some choices and opportunities, as Shanghai has shown, or Singapore, to exercise choice within economic constraints. Speaking from political perspective, or educational perspective, or legal perspective of juridification of choices, right? There are quite open dilemmas about where exactly do we want to go. And that's the radical uncertainty that we live in a sense of Asian city, that we don't have to look at New York or Kansas City anymore. But that's a burden also. Best practices will be shared between cities and will be observed as best or not so good between cities constantly. So, and those networks have emerged relatively recently. Again, we can see municipal networks in the 1890s when Melbourne goes and looks at London and also looks at Mumbai about how to create some bylaws. But today it's intensified to such a great degree. And the most important thing here is that cities are not entities. Coordination, as Professor said, is the crucial issue precisely because they're not containers or entities. They're loose agglomerations of very disparate forces. And that's why I put, again, maybe bad term, but general idea of stakeholders, of forces that will have to negotiate that. And that's what we try to identify in these megacities.
Sorry, since there's no one else, I'll ask another one. I have a concern about issues of scale, or perhaps the unit of analysis that you're using in your study. It was actually something that I thought of when Prasanjit was making his comment just now. You talked about the problematic of methodological nationalism, right? So if you have a map and you show Russia as being 70% urban, that obscures the fact that that population lives in a particular series of urban areas. But I'm actually concerned whether the city isn't perhaps the unit of analysis for what I think you're trying to do. Certainly, you're talking about global connections in particular ways, but I think that they're associated with particular parts of cities, particular enclaves, and it's no surprise that we see the same sort of high-rise landscapes come up time and time again for each of these cities. So while the cities that you're talking about do have the kinds of trans-border connections, global hinterland that Prasanjit talked about, I think many other parts of these cities actually are still very much connected to their surrounding rural hinterland in very conventional ways within their national borders. So just wonder whether you might actually downscale your unit analysis.
I'm not sure about downscale, but that is exactly what we are looking at, and I think that's the crucial issue. Because if you look at a city as any kind of administrative or spatial boundary, or even one derived from remote sensing, right, the boundaries of activities that we can sense, we are leaving out the idea of cities as attractor points. What we are trying to introduce here is that there is the new type of center-periphery structure, for better or worse, in which these cities as both symbolic centers, but also that inscribes itself on space, as spatial centers, and hence the pointing to the centers of the cities, sometimes multinodal centers in many cases in which several of those spatial centers interact. They do form as kind of very loose coupling around those center-periphery structures. And so the change of paradigm in which we thought about cities and accidentally about nations as containers, as something that is, well, maybe not homogeneous but has clear boundaries, to the paradigm in which we think about cities as attractor points for multiple centers to form and converge. And interactions with these center points, again, from high-power elite interactions to more down to micro-level interactions, as circuit breakers between those institutional realms. So again, really trying to reconceptualize what we mean by a city, and I think we are forced to do so by the major change that brought us to this mega-city networks that are connected in such multiple ways that they're not necessarily embedded in their spatial hinterland anymore as much. So again, something just to think about for us, and we're trying to develop this framework. So, as has been said, in 2 years, 2.5 years from now, we will have few answers, not all the answers.
Thank you very much indeed for a fine presentation. I should tell you that when we thought about putting this conference together, we had a few concerns, and among them, and probably at the top of the list, were two. One was faculty members tend to speak in 50-minute quanta. How would we ever be able to compress it to 30 minutes? The other was faculty members tend to speak to their colleagues in their own special language, and they'll do that here. And so 1/3 of the audience approximately will know what's going on. And I want to congratulate all three speakers for telling us how wrong we were. I think you've done a terrific job of, first of all, staying on time, giving us ample time for discussion. And secondly, at least convincing one layperson as far as these talks are concerned that one could understand more or less what was being presented. So thank you all. I suggest we give all the presenters a little more. I know that Prof. Cedaram wants to say a few words to close.
I want to thank Professor Showalter. So can you have one more round of applause for him for moderating and managing not just the time but also the lively discussions. I think there are three takeaways. It maybe was not intentional, but I think it strikes me obviously. I'll go in the reverse order. Certainly in line with the vision of GAI, we will hopefully at the end of a couple of years, as Misha mentioned, we will understand better about how Asia will play a role in the global modernity, and we will be able to contribute a new body of knowledge. And we certainly take note that it will be driven by cities. And so with the second research project, I hope we will become more precise and hopefully also more accurate about what we understand about urbanization and within countries and in Asia. And learning from the first study, Keesing mentioned that diabetes, type 2 diabetes is global problem, is an Asian problem. I don't know if I should footnote, is it an urban problem as well? So that means cities will have more type 2 diabetes patients if they are not careful and cautious because of the way the lifestyles are sedentary and workaholic lifestyles and so on. But certainly gave us some comfort that more coffee is better, but I don't know whether with milk or with sugar, how it is. We will have this discussion continued on August 11th, where we will have 2 more of those 5 who will present, and I hope all of you will join again for this lively discussion. We are also doing simultaneously another important activity that will be with the associates, the MC members, and the grant winners, to also look at what does it mean for the longer term. As I said in the beginning, these are basically seeds to catalyze really long-term research. So we want to have a roundtable discussion with you. So those of you who will participate in it, we want you to join here at 1:30 after lunch. This is really a working lunch, I think, so I hope that you'll have further interaction during the lunchtime so that we will network as associates. And so thank you once again, and